Good evening. I am Mark Smith. I'm a member of the Economics and Business Department, and I would like to welcome you to the 2015 version of the H. Chase Stone Lecture and introduce our speaker, Professor Sylvia Nasar, the John S. and John L. Knight Professor at the Columbia School of Journalism. Thank you all for coming. And before I continue, please turn off your cell phones or anything that might interrupt the talk while during our lecture. Before I introduce Professor Nasar, I want to say something about the origin of the lecture. The H. Chase Stone Lecture was established by a generous gift of the First National Bank of Colorado Springs to honor its 8th president, H. Chase Stone. H. Chase Stone came to Colorado Springs in 1904 as a young man to recover from tuberculosis at the Cragmores Sanitarium. After 10 years at the sanitarium, he was discharged and joined the First National Bank. Now, what I've just read to you is part of an introduction I've given many times when I've introduced this lecture. And there you go. But there's a connection between H. Chase Stone and the first great American economist, Irving Fisher. Because 25 years before, Irving Fisher had also been diagnosed with tuberculosis. And before I read this in Sylvia Nasar's book, I thought, yeah, this is kind of boilerplate. Okay, tuberculosis, 10 years of the sanitarium. This was the AIDS of the 19th century. It was a devastating disease. It hit young people. These people were ostracized. The likelihood that they were going to survive was very low. And so that the fact that both Irving Fisher and H. Chase Stone went on to recover from the disease and make significant contributions is impressive. And what did H. Chase Stone do? He went on to be a civic leader, dedicated primarily to serving education, serving on the board of directors for the Colorado School of the Deaf and Blind, the Fountain Valley School, and as chair of the board of trustees of Colorado College. All of you, by being here tonight, honor that legacy. And so I thank you for coming to this lecture. Personally, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Vivica Perria-Foreman, Esther Redmount, and Pedro de Rojo for their support and help in organizing this lecture, the staff members of the Economics and Business Department, and especially Kathy Lindeman, who coordinates all of our events. Without their help, this lecture would not be possible. The H. Chase Stone Lecture provides the college with the opportunity to bring a renowned individual to discuss a topic of importance in business and finance. Past speakers have included former Treasury Secretary. This echo has a strange, I find myself trying to correct my voice in this microphone and getting a very strange effect. Past speakers have included Robert Rubin, University of Chicago professor and Freakonomics author Stephen Levitt, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors Christine Roma, as well as the Nobel Prize winner and CC alumnus James Heckman, class of '65. Tonight we welcome. Am I here? Are you hearing and I hearing the same thing here? Sylvia Nasar. When I was 17, my older brother gave me a book, The Microbe Hunters by Paul de Kruif. He told me that it inspired many to become microbiologists. That well-intentioned gift failed to have that inspirational effect. I made it through chapter 1. It was about this French guy, Louis Pasteur. He learned to boil milk. He now has his name on all cartons of milk. But that's enough about microbiology. Last year, I gave a different book to my son. He's a physics major with a strong interest in social justice. That book was Grand Pursuit. Its author is Sylvia Nasar. Learning from my brother's mistake, I said, you can't read just chapter 1. That's on Marx and Engels. You have to get through chapter 2. That's about Alfred Marshall. Finish this book, and you want to be an economist. And why? Why would you want to be an economist? Because how society chooses to solve the three fundamental questions of what to produce, how to produce it, and who should get it matters. But more powerfully, the story that Sylvia Nasar tells is one in which ideas matter. Ideas of both men and women who sought to improve the material condition of mankind. Nasar opens her book with a quote from the Canadian-born Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith's Affluent Society. The experience of nations with well-being is exceedingly brief. Nearly all throughout history have been very poor. Keynes put the challenge to economists thus: economists are not the trustees of civilization, but the possibility of civilization. That is the grand pursuit. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and pleasure to give you Professor Sylvia Nasar.
I want to thank Mark and President Tiefenthaler, Esther, the Economics Department, and the Stone Endowment for what has been a wonderful visit in Colorado Springs. And I am so excited to have a chance to tell you the story of how an extremely dismal science, a science really of resignation, turned into a tool for improving the human condition, and to maybe talk with you after the lecture about some of the ways that the most basic insights of developed by these beautiful minds, how they are useful today in thinking about and getting our arms around today's economic challenges. Actually, the book starts not with Marx and Engels, but with Jane Austen, and the idea that humanity didn't need to be a slave of dire necessity is so new that Jane Austen never entertained it. By 1800, trade and the Industrial Revolution were swelling the nation's wealth, swelling Britain's wealth, but even the most enlightened thinkers of the day had no doubt that the rising prosperity would not trump God's condemnation of the mass of humanity and the bulk of English citizens to God's condemnation to poverty and painful toil all the days of your life. From the birth of Christ to the birth of Victoria, the universal standard of life, the average standard of living, the average consumption per person on the planet never departed for long or very far from mere subsistence. If you were to draw a chart, a bar chart, with every century you would see what looked like a row of bottom teeth. Only one pops up. There was a little bump up in average living standards when European food supplies had to be shared by fewer people because of the Black Death. That was a good century. The rest were at subsistence. So in all societies, as Galbraith said, in every epoch, the bottom 90%, the 9 parts in 10 of the whole race of mankind, in Burke's words, were condemned to lives of mere survival and terrible poverty. The material circumstances of the Englishman, the average Englishman who was a farm laborer, weren't really any better than those of a Roman slave. His shelter consisted of a dark, smoky room, which of course he shared with wife and many children. His light and heat was a smoky fire. His clothes were the ones he wore on his back. He couldn't read or write, and he had no reason to hope that his children would either. When he wasn't actually starving, he lived in chronic fear of starvation. One station in life was permanent, determined, just like your blue eyes. In Jane Austen's lifetime, everybody knew their place and knew that they weren't going to be leaving it. The notion that man was a creature of his circumstance, that those circumstances were not predetermined, immutable, or utterly impervious to human intervention is one of the most radical discoveries of all time. It implied that given new tools, given new ways of thinking, humanity could finally exert control, take charge of its own material circumstances. The invention of modern economics, this cheerful or relatively cheerful science, began with an act of imagination. In the worst of times, that is the worst decade of the 19th century, the 1840s, Charles Dickens, the novelist, returned to London from his American book tour to find the city racked with industrial depression, hunger, and class strife. He was a great admirer of the French Revolution. He was determined to strike a blow for the poor. He hoped that the story he had in mind about a rich miser's change of heart would strike the hearts of London's middle classes like a sledgehammer with 20,000 times the force of a political pamphlet. Despite the reputation of Panglossian optimism, many, if not most, thinking Victorians in the middle of the 19th century viewed the future with great foreboding. Food shortages, pollution, epidemics, resource depletion, foreign competition, and of course, the gap between rich and poor and the class conflict that it threatened. The Christmas Carol is an explicit attack on this deeply pessimistic outlook. Indeed, it's an attack very specifically on the dismal economics of the day. In contrast to Thomas Carlyle's nightmare of galloping scarcity and social strife, Dickens decides to depict a world of abundance, a world of amity, a world of cooperation among the classes, and the symbol of that, of course, is the Cratchit's Christmas feast, and in particular, Mrs. Cratchit's flaming Christmas pudding, which is exactly the opposite of Scrooge's thin gruel that he sips by himself in a cold room. Like many Victorian intellectuals, Dickens came to long for a new economics, came to think that a new economics was called for, a, quote, hopeful science, a science of possibility, a science with a little human bloom, a little human warmth. He was, at the time, dismissed as Mr. Sentiment. That was Trollope's dismissive name for him. But the Christmas Carol actually turned out to be so much more prescient than the predictions of the pundits and experts who mocked him. The Panic of 1866, which broke out in London's financial district, spurred Karl Marx, whose manuscript was about almost 20 years overdue, to finish Das Kapital. The upsurge in joblessness, the material distress, radicalized the middle class, especially university students, converting students, women, journalists, and artists into social reformers. And that spirit stimulated a 23-year-old Cambridge Don to search for ideas that, as he put it, could put mankind in the saddle. I don't know how many of you recognize the line. It comes from a poem by Emerson, in which he writes that mankind is ridden instead of being in the saddle, ridden by, by many things in modern life. Marshall was a product of London's struggling lower middle class. He was destined for the ministry, or perhaps a clerkship at the Bank of England like his father held, but instead he turned himself first into a mathematician, then a philosopher, and finally, and somewhat reluctantly, he turned himself into the inventor of a new economics. He was drawn to the subject by a detour that he took during a university break. He had a backpack full of Kant and other philosophers. He decided to stop in Manchester on his way to the Highlands, and he tramped around the slums of Manchester, around the factory districts, quote, looking into the faces of the poor. And the sight of so much want amid so much wealth, because Manchester was a very, very affluent city with great public buildings, the sight of so much want amid so much wealth prompted him to ask whether the existence of a proletariat, meaning the existence of a huge class of people whose only social role is to drudge their way through life for others with no possibility of pursuing their own ends, whether the existence of a proletariat was a necessity of nature. Why, he wondered, should you not make every man a gentleman? Well, his Cambridge friends, who urged him to, why don't you learn some political economy? They directed him to people like John Stuart Mill, who was the reigning economic authority, who was a socialist, a feminist, a social reformer, but who declared that the Industrial Revolution, which was now almost 100 years old, had not benefited the bottom 9/10 of British society one iota, and that Britain had nearly reached the limits of her economic potential. Karl Marx, who proved that intensifying competition would inevitably cause the working class to swell and wages to shrink. Half a dozen other lesser political economists who insisted that a proletariat is a necessity of nature. Marshall acknowledged the logic of some of these arguments, yet he retained some skepticism about their empirical assumptions that were being made. As a self-made man, he wondered whether institutions and habits that the classical economists, the Mills, the Marx, supposed were frozen and rigid, might not now, in fact, be fluid. As a mathematician, he wondered whether Mill and Marx really appreciated the cumulative effect of evolutionary change. He was particularly struck by statistics that showed that, in fact, the laws of economics no longer seemed to describe what was happening in England. In particular, he discovered that wages were not behaving the way the iron law of wages dictated. Instead of remaining tethered to subsistence, they were actually rising. Marshall's favorite phrase was natura confacit saltum. Nature makes no leaps, or more prosaically, change is incremental. But by 1867, real wages had been edging up for almost 2 decades. That is, almost from the time of the publication of The Christmas Carol in the mid-1840s, the Hungry Decade. Real wages, meaning wages adjusted for prices, were actually going up. And the cumulative progress in workers' living standards was so dramatic that the Prime Minister, Gladstone, who is not exactly given to hyperbole, called it unexampled in the history of any country or in any age, which was actually quite accurate. And by the way, the most dramatic chapter in Das Kapital includes the Gladstone quote, except that it's carefully edited to mean precisely the opposite. I know none of you would do that. So there must be some ingenious mechanism at work to produce this amazing and result of rising living standards over a period of 20 years, which shouldn't have happened according to economic theory. What was that ingenious mechanism? And more urgently, was there any reason to think that it would continue to operate? Perhaps this was a confluence of one-time factors. And unless Marshall could show that it would, you really couldn't say whether the widespread hopes for social progress could ever be reconciled with economic reality. Marshall dedicated himself to investigating economic reality far, far beyond the towers of St. John's College in Cambridge. And he spent every summer, every break, no longer climbing in the Highlands, but visiting every center of English industry, interviewing scores of owners, managers, technicians, workers, union leaders, to learn how their industry, how their businesses worked. By contrast, of course, Karl Marx, this was one of the more surprising discoveries that I made in the course of researching Grand Pursuit. Turned out that Karl Marx, who most people think of as, a chronicler of the Industrial Revolution, in addition to a theorist of capitalist decline, never set foot inside a factory. He also, in almost all of his adult life, never had a paying job. Now, someone is going to jump up and say, oh, but there's the column that he was writing for the New York Herald. Actually, Engels wrote all those columns. So Marshall was, despite his aspirations, his philosophical aspirations, felt compelled to investigate reality. And by the way, that was a big trend in Victorian England, both among journalists, among social workers, among at least some scholars, it is absolutely crucial to the credibility of Marshall's theories. So what he observed two things that struck him. One was that in all these firms that he visited, he noticed that managers were obsessed, totally focused on constantly looking for ways to achieve more with the same resources. That is, to increase the productivity of their operations. They were responding to competitive pressure from rivals. They tweaked product design. They streamlined production. They got better suppliers. They improved their organization 100 different ways. But this was the function and the objective of many of the, not just the owners or the top managers, but right on down to even including skilled workers. So that was one thing, that competitive pressures caused firms to seek constant, often small, incremental improvements in productivity. The second thing that he noticed is that individual employers actually didn't set wages. Okay, so when I'm teaching and we're doing a case study of Walmart, almost all my students come in firmly believing that Walmart can set wages, okay? Not just in some rural market where they have a monopoly, but in White Plains, in northern Jersey, etc. Okay, so Marshall realized that, in fact, very few companies were in a position to set wages. They had to pay what the going rate was for a given type of labor. The fact that they were willing to pay skilled workers 2 or 3 times as much as unskilled labor implied something that really contradicted existing theory. It implied that wages depended on workers' current contribution to current output, not on some biological minimum. Okay? So demand for labor, not only supply, Marshall realized, determined pay. Okay, so taking these two things together, the firm as a productivity raising organization, the worker whose pay is determined partly by demand for his skills, and the whole picture, all the future prospects change, because if wages rise with productivity, it means that there is hope that of improvement in the condition, the economic circumstances of the bulk of the population. Okay? Now, this is something that we can look at, of course. We can see, do wages move with productivity? And the answer is yes. Sometimes they depart for a period of time, but in the long run, they do. Marshall was right, and his friend, the historian Arnold Toynbee, called Marshall's theory the first great hope that there was a way to raise wages without a revolution or totally tearing down existing institutions. Okay, so this was a huge insight, and it implied that over time, that wages would rise, real wages, real living standards, and that the proletariat would eventually disappear. So while Dickens also never went into a factory, although he has a brilliant description of Coketown, but he didn't go in because he wasn't interested. He compared factories to prisons. Marx viewed paid employment as dehumanizing, although I don't know how he would know that. But Marshall saw that the primary economic function, social function of the modern business firm, the corporation, was not just to make the shareholders rich, but was to raise the nation's living standards, okay, by pursuing improvements in productivity. When I was in graduate school, Alfred Marshall was dismissed as a naive, sentimental, and kind of fusty old Victorian who was really nothing more than an apologist for the status quo. And yet, if you look at what happened from 1870 until now, you'll see that, that his seemingly Pollyanna-ish expectations were hugely understated, okay? So if you look at actually the whole period from 1820, the time that Jane Austen was alive, you see this flat line going over many centuries, and then an elbow at the 19th where that's Marshall's century, so in which the average standard of living, which determined largely by the real wage, doubled, okay? So huge departure from the historical record, but that was nothing compared to the 20th century when the average standard of living in the world grew eightfold, okay? So this is this ingenious mechanism, this modern economy is, the distinctive feature isn't that it employs everybody. It's not. I mean, so did feudal economies. So, I mean, for most of history, everybody's had to work, from children to old people. So that's not the distinctive feature. Job create, not the distinctive feature of this economy. The distinctive feature is that it's capable of raising living standards of the population by multiples in a generation or 2 generations or 3. Okay, so the Panic of 1866 which so galvanized Marx in his, he kind of lived in a very nice, sort of like a brownstone. Wasn't the death knell of English commercial society, as he hoped. It was just the start of a recession, actually a pretty nasty one, but the economy soon rebounded. England moved, I was going to say became a democracy, but I've been corrected. It moved, it became more democratic, and the average wage continued to rise. And Marshall really is the person who gets credit for turning the old dismal science into a search for tools for changing society, for changing people's circumstances. And the way that Paul Samuelson would have put it, if he was still alive, is that before Alfred Marshall, economics was about what you couldn't do, okay? It was about what you couldn't do and what you'd better resign yourself to. And after Marshall, it became about what you could do. Not in a utopian sense, but in a sense of given an understanding of how things worked, there are possibilities for incremental, positive change year in, year out. But Marshall was deeply troubled about one thing, especially toward the end of his career, and that was London's huge underclass, who seemed completely impervious to economic progress. The cause of their poverty appeared to be, to Marshall, poverty itself, with each generation unable to prevent the next generation from repeating their experience. So who is responsible? Who could intervene? Again, the conventional wisdom, well into the 1870s and possibly even early 1880s, was that government provision for the poor, government subsidies for the poor, was incompatible with a market economy. Mill argued that if the government intervened by taxing the affluent, the most productive members in society, in order to subsidize the least productive, then the population would increase, causing more unemployment, even higher taxation. Eventually, quote, taxation for the support of the poor would engross the whole income of the country. He sounds like some of those deficit, people who are obsessed with the federal deficit, engross the whole income of the country. Appropriately for the feminist that Mill actually was, he was a very, very, despite his pessimism and his blind spots about economics, Mill was a very progressive person. He was really a feminist, and very appropriately, he was proved wrong by a woman. Okay, so you are young, pretty, rich, clever. What more do you want? This is what a poor relation of Beatrice Potter asked her with more than a little trace of exasperation. Why cannot you be satisfied? Beatrice Potter was like the heroine of Henry James' Portrait of a Lady. She'd been brought up with unusual freedom to read, to form friendships, to travel, and to satisfy her great desire for knowledge. She was born in 1858. She was the 9th daughter of a railway magnate and a political liberal. The family owned the Manchester Guardian. She was brought up in the midst of capitalist speculation and the restless spirit of big enterprise. I should say that Beatrice, who then became, whose last name then changed, was probably the most brilliant diarist of the Victorian and Edwardian era. And if you ever have a chance, I urge you to dip into them, because she is a brilliant sketcher of personalities and scenes. She was, in addition to her expectations that she would marry an important man, as at least 7 of her 7 older sisters had done, Beatrice wanted to have it all. She wanted a real aim and occupation. Her mentor, Herbert Spencer, the libertarian philosopher, who coined the term survival of the fittest, encouraged her. She took his advice, and long before her extraordinary career as a, quote, social investigator, again, someone who went underground in a sweatshop to write about sweatshop conditions, took part in her cousin Charles Booth's survey of the poor in London, later wrote countless books, who long before the end of her career had convinced the young Winston Churchill and quite a few other politicians on the liberal end that the government could in fact fight poverty without fatally injuring the ingenious mechanism. In her early 30s, she teamed up with, first she discovered that she was now a socialist, that she was in sync with the spirit of the time, and she teamed up with the brain behind a coterie of young men, among them George Bernard Shaw, who were manipulating the mainstream parties to voice a growing desire for state action. Those were the Fabians. They called themselves collectivists, but they merely wished to tame the Frankenstein of competition and free enterprise rather than to kill it, and they wanted to tax the rich, not exterminate them. After a year of telling Sidney, who is the son of a hairdresser, and I should say the short and kind of dumpy son of a hairdresser, of telling him, "I do not love you," and Sidney promising her the world, in other words, promising her that life together would consist of abstemious living. She was a bit of a, she had a bit of a eating disorder. Abstemious living, copious research, and constant socializing, presumably in lieu of sex and babies. When he promised her all that, she went ahead and married him, and on her way out of or I guess when she got home from the registry office, she wrote, "It seems an extraordinary end to the once brilliant Beatrice Potter to marry an ugly little man with no social position and less means." Ironically, their marriage, which, although it was made in the registry office, was in fact quite heavenly. They were, one of London's power couples. They socialized with prime ministers and politicians and scholars and everybody. They were a two-person think tank, probably the first in history. They directed a phalanx of research assistants. They analyzed data and wrote all day, and they lobbied politicians and journalists in their very own political salon at night. H.G. Wells, who fell out with them at some point, H.G. Wells, of course, also having been a Fabian, wrote a satire about them called The New Machiavelli, and he has one of the regulars at the salon say, "Everyone comes here. The Webbs' Spartan dinners are a, quote, center of reference for all sorts of legislative proposals and political expedients." So it was at one of these extremely Spartan dinners, and even the wine that Beatrice served was kind of cheap, that Beatrice rolled out her idea of something she called the household state, and that we now call the welfare state. And she did so to the young and somewhat boorish Winston Churchill. She who was actually a very good target, because one of the first things he said to Beatrice is, I never do my own brain work that anyone else can do for me. And she was very, very willing to do that. Now, what was she proposing? She was not proposing to equalize all incomes in Britain. She was not an egalitarian by any means, but she thought that inequality and, some people having less than others was inevitable, but she didn't think that destitution was inevitable. And she very clearly thought of this housekeeping state, which she defined as government guaranteeing every single citizen a minimum standard of living, a minimum amount of food, clothing, education, health care, and so on, which was then a very radical idea. Now, of course, I don't think there's a single government in the world that doesn't have that responsibility. And by the way, if there are any Hayekians in the audience, Hayek was believed very firmly in this kind of welfare state that guaranteed a minimum. Now, what made Beatrice such a terrific saleswoman of radical ideas, radical reform proposals, was that she was not only that she was still beautiful and very flirty, and that she knew everybody who was in power, and everybody knew her, but that she was very good at packaging, novel proposals as very natural, very modest, and entirely incremental. I'm sorry, I have to get a drink of water. Thank you. What? I'm at my time? Okay, all right. So the way that she overcame the standard objections, which were that it would ruin incentives, it would bankrupt the country, was by making what we would now call a supply-side argument. It was, look, the bottom third of London's population is so impaired by their conditions of life, by malnutrition, disease, etc., that they can't serve in the army, they can't work, and they can't take care of their children. So her argument was that, yes, taxing the affluent to, the most productive to subsidize the least productive might have some dampening effect on incentives, but in fact, it would be offset by the drag on productivity from that would be offset by higher productivity because now these people were contributing. She made the argument to Churchill just at a time when he realized that the Tory party was kind of over and that the country was moving to the left, and he was looking for a way to follow. He ran on the Liberal ticket. He and his campaign focused on the cause of the left-out millions and urging the government to draw a line below which, quote, "we will not allow persons to live and labor." That is precisely the policy that Beatrice had been urging on him. And not only did Churchill give hundreds of speeches about establishing this kind of welfare state, but the Liberals actually won the election in 1908, and Churchill, and in league with Lloyd George, sponsored legislation of that the historian Eli Halevi calls of almost revolutionary importance, and a lot of people would be interested in hearing this today, namely the minimum wage, another Beatrice idea. Let me just wrap up. There are, so Marshall and Beatrice were the first pioneers, and for Beatrice, by the way, if you look at the data on the growth of the welfare state, and you ask yourself, what's the aggregate evidence that it had the negative effect on productivity growth that the conventional wisdom said it did, you will see, because I did that, and you will see that the strongest productivity growth, the fastest rise in living standards for the average person did not happen in the era of tiny government, which was the era before World War I, but rather in the era of rapidly expanding welfare states after 1950. The other thing that I did was to when I learned that Sweden had the second best to the United States, long-term record of productivity growth and stock market performance, I looked at the data on the relative size of government in the US and Sweden, and probably no surprise, Sweden's government is twice as big in terms of the national income as the United States. However, has the same productivity performance. Now, what does that mean? It seems to mean that, at least in some cases, if you have a extremely competitive, unprotected private sector, as Sweden does, as the United States does, and by the way, the Swedes would not save Saab at the same time that we, of course, bailed out GM. If you have a private sector like that, that is, constantly achieving productivity gains, then you can have a big, you can have a big welfare state, a small welfare state, but it's productivity growth that wags the dog, not necessarily the other way around. So she too, even though her ideas were unconventional, eccentric, much criticized when she first advanced them, now, the welfare state is everywhere. It's not going to be rolled back, obviously, and productivity continues to rise, and as do living standards. So the modern economics began with this insight that poverty is not necessarily man's fate, and in a very tangible way, economics became a tool for escaping it. Marshall innovated this, a new apparatus of the mind by challenging the conventional, the consensus in classical economics. He predicted that competition among firms, and he also, by the way, was challenging the dominant opinion among not just socialists, but liberals and people with an interest in social conditions, that the firm was an instrument of oppression and impoverishment. He turned that around and said, no, it's in fact, it's really, it's really the main anti-poverty program. And then Beatrice came along to show that taxing the rich to empower the poor could speed up this very gradual process that generated by the competitive economy. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say. I'm eager to hear your comments and thoughts, and thank you very much. I'd rather stand.
Okay. Please. We invite your questions.
And comments. And disagreements.
We're live streaming so that the people listening can hear you. Please come down to the microphone. So please, we invite your questions.
Oh, microphone.
Good evening. Thanks
Hi.
so much for being here this evening. My name's Kelly Townsend. I'm a retired science teacher that's worked in this city for many years, and I'm enjoying retirement right now. And I don't read much science anymore, but I like to read a lot of economics and politics and all that. So my question, I'll give it to you first, and I'll give you some background behind the question, is, and I've had trouble putting this together, is there a historical critical mass of people and that mass of people, their willingness to be taxed so that a more ideal way of living can restore the middle class and raise up the poor in our nation? Heavy question. The background behind it is some of the research that you've done is very similar to a book I just read called A Social Democratic America by Dr. Lance Kenworthy out of the University of Arizona, who has a blueprint for progressive thought, and it's very specific about what the nation, the United States, can do.
Right.
As far as things like sick leave, infrastructure, retraining people, universal health care. But he goes beyond that, and he says, here's how we're going to pay for it. A 12% VAT, plus other things along the way, and it would probably double or higher the federal income tax. So anyway, the question again, do you want me to repeat?
No, I'm just, thinking
there's
I'm
a
going
lot
to
there.
soon be doing my taxes.
There's a lot.
After several
There's a lot
years of
going on.
extremely low income, I did just sell a book, and I'm not thinking that this is going to happen.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
Look, first of all, these radical, these sort of either-or radical changes generally don't happen. Right? I mean, just like economic change, political change is somewhat incremental. The real debate or one of the real debates is about the 5 percentage points of GDP that would have to be raised in taxes or cut in government spending to accommodate the people like me who are going to be using Social Security and Medicare. So if that's where the debate is, I don't think anyone's entertaining large, large changes in the tax system, and which I personally think is okay.
Thanks.
Look, I think that, the Sweden-US comparison, what it shows, and, actually Joseph Schumpeter was the person who really focused on the fact that the economic performance of different countries, that there's a stunning differences in the economic performance of different countries, and often very similar countries, okay? Which is, and if you look at the 10-year growth rate of a bunch of countries and array them from the worst to the best, you'll find that the range is, and this is over a 10-year period, -5% a year reduction in the average standard of living, that is in North Korea and Iraq, a disastrous performance not even equaled in World War I or World War II, and on the best end is Equatorial New Guinea growing at 15%. I think that's kind of an outlier, but the Chinas and Indias and so forth. So there are these huge and persistent differences, and what does that tell you? I think it tells you that the local economic environment really matters. That it matters more, in fact, than global influences, okay? Because if these large global influences or universal changes like technology were dominant, then everybody would be performing the same. So that gets to, another point, which is presumably local conditions are partly shaped by culture, history, as well as politics and ideas, how people think, what people think works and doesn't. And there's a huge variation. And what works in Sweden, guess what? American voters, whether they're right or wrong, it doesn't matter. They don't want to live in, they don't want Swedish institutions. We can admire Sweden, I certainly do, but that's not going to happen. That kind of, because it just won't fly with the voters.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, go ahead. Nobody?
I'll ask a question.
Oh. He always asks the really hard ones, where you have to say, oh, I don't know.
So you were, early in your talk, you were talking about Alfred Marshall and the fact that wage growth had occurred because of increases in productivity amongst workers and skilled workers. And so that, but we look at the last 30, 40 years in the United States, one of the explanations for the divergence in increase in income inequality is that the type of economic growth has actually increased the productivity of people, knowledge workers, people at the upper end of the spectrum, and not as much at the lower end of the spectrum. And so, so that I think that we'd all like some comfort that there is some possibility that the productivity at the low, that there's some way of increasing productivity at the lower end of the spectrum. So to paraphrase Scrooge, speak comfort to me.
Right.
Speak comfort to me, Marley.
Well, I mean, I think, these debates get so polarized so fast, but obviously there are many ways that you could do this. You could, tax the rich, to, to increase the, say, the earned income tax credit. You could, but a totally different way would be to make education more effective and accessible to people who, are dropping out of high school, and seeing their real wages. These are people whose real wages have actually declined very sharply, because obviously a lot of this of inequality is within labor, and it's universal across countries. I was looking at data, for China, Korea, Sweden. It's happening everywhere, which also tells you that it can't really be, Obama or the, horrible Republicans in Congress, or it can't be domestic policy that's, that's driving growing inequality. It's probably something like technology, as Mark said. But I think that I think that that improving basic education is important, because what a basic education does, a general education, is lets you get into a company, and businesses do a fantastic job of training people in very company-specific skills. Okay, that's what they do. Schools shouldn't be doing that. But people can't benefit from that training if they are innumerate or functionally illiterate. So that would be one way. You can.
Thank you.
I can hear.
In 1972, I bought a property with a balloon mortgage. It was a 20-year mortgage with a 10-year balloon. It ballooned in 1982, and I had to either lose the property or refinance the property. I shopped around. The lowest mortgage rate that I could find was 18%. And I look today, and I see these low mortgage rates.
I have a 3.5% mortgage.
You have a 3.5%?
30 years.
I think that's a good thing to have. It seems to me that these interest rates have been artificially held very low by the federal government by just printing the money. And I wonder what the long-term effect of that is going to be. It's distorted the whole economy. It has driven money into non-productive areas. What do you see as the long-term effect of the tremendous increase in debt? If you look, for example, at the debt carried by corporations, it's normal to see a debt equal to at least 3 times the earnings. Would you buy a business that has a debt of 3 times the earnings? What will be the long-term effect of these things, these distortions in our economy?
Well, the effect that people usually worry about first is inflation. And people have been worrying about that if the Fed's easy money policy would, cause inflation to take off. And, for a number of years, maybe 5 years, and that hasn't happened. Okay, so that's good. On the other hand, our economy seems to be coming back to life. That's also good. So I guess I don't really know the answer to your question, but I'm not that concerned about Fed policy in the. I'm not, I don't see huge dangers. Does anyone else? Well, what do you think is the threat that's lurking? See,
Well, the threat
yeah.
is that if interest rates go up, all these big corporations have big debts.
Right.
They roll over every couple of years.
Right.
They're able to service the debt today at these low interest rates.
Right.
When those interest rates go up, they will not be able to service, or they'll certainly
They-
have a lot of difficulty, and a lot of them will have such difficulty that they'll probably go insolvent, go bankrupt.
Yes. So the question is, how many of those firms are there? But look, I thought that that companies' cash holdings and their profit margins were practically at a record high. So I don't know that, as a group, corporations are going to have a lot of trouble servicing debt. I mean, some, I agree, some will go under, but I don't see it as a broad, systemic crisis. I mean, I think what people are wondering is when are corporations going to feel that it's profitable to spend?
Okay, thank you. I have long thought that those things that Marshall has thought and never knew it. So thank you.
Okay.
But the thing is that based upon that thought premise, I have also felt that a major cultural problem that we have in not being able to take our resources, whether the resources be from people who are financially more able or not, just concentrating our resources into productivity in terms of education and training and so forth, has been that there is a perception culturally because of our capitalist formulation that we currently operate with, that the value, the ownership of our knowledge is our own ownership and our own capital investment in ourselves, and that we should take that with us wherever we go, and therefore we're responsible for investing in that and ourselves. And to whatever extent our society advances the investment in education, of course, that's not true. But I am making a reference to the fact that it has occurred to me that it would be possible for our formulation of relationships to be such that corporations should by new cultural adaptation, actually pay for the education of the young person who is getting that education and own an interest, as in stock, in that young person's future payroll earning capability, regardless of where he or she goes. And that the reason for if that were done, that would unleash the corporate capitalism where it needs to go, which is to leverage the development of this improved knowledge class, because at the moment that knowledge class isn't being developed because there is kind of a chokehold on how that knowledge is being acquired. It's being leveraged in a negative way against the person who would want to acquire it, because that person has no real purchasing power of his own. And he having no such purchasing power of his own, he may be motivated by wanting to get college loans and all the rest of that in order to get his education, but that's not going to be the same as the dynamic of a corporation saying, I will invest in you, young man, and if you don't stay with my company, then I will still own some percentage of your future income because I did that.
Well, I mean, the companies I worked for did pay for, there was a tuition benefit. In fact, Columbia gives a tuition benefit. I think a lot of large employers do. The problem is that, compensation is compensation. You get more in wages, you get less in benefits, you get more of one benefit, like an education benefit, you have to cut elsewhere. Because again, companies pay what the going rate for compensation. So within that framework, I think that if workers want that, companies will offer it, and if they don't, they won't. But I don't think that I'm not sure that companies are going to take on those kinds of really unprecedented responsibilities. And I do think that general education is not, it's not really something that business is either responsible for or, experienced in providing. That's what schools are supposed to do.
This is more of a sociological question, so I'm not sure you want to answer it. Okay, thank you. Education, to eliminate or minimize the destitution in our country, education seems to be the most promising answer. However, it's difficult to motivate a child that's in the lower echelons of our society to discipline him or herself if their family is broken. In your research, has there anybody talked about this element of the family being critical to any society advancing its productivity and standard of living? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and I think that, a lot of us are parents here, and we all know that our children's first education is in the home, and it's what, it has a great influence on how children do in school. Yes, there's a huge education literature, but I'm not familiar with it. But I'm sure you're right.
No fault divorce has been harmful, but that again, that's not a economic.
Wait, right.
Is that too crazy? Okay. All right, but it's just an idea of that. We can don't have to talk about that, but the idea of the family being so critical.
Right.
To really, if you're going to talk about minimum wage laws and you're going to talk about all these other things, without a strong family, I don't see it working.
Okay. Here's what I have to say about that, which is, it's like just war. Really, you can only sort of reasonably adopt policies that you have some reason for thinking will work and that you're capable of executing. I don't know anyone who knows how to, what policies would make strong families. Again, it's kind of a worldwide phenomenon.
As I was wandering around, circling back, I saw a number of copies of Sylvia's books. She would be delighted to sign them for you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.